Hi, Rebekah, thanks for coming. So you're at the Writing Center, and
Yes.
we're here to talk today about improving student writing. I think when we had first met to kind of talk about things that both of us find pretty important, you had a nifty idea that you used oftentimes as a guiding principle, as at least that's what you were kind of talking about when we first met. So I think you have it here.
Yeah, I do
today,
actually. I just think it's powerful, and it's something when we're talking about writing in the academic disciplines that this idea keeps popping up, and it's from this fellow who's been around for a while. He's a bit of a granddaddy in the field. So David Bartholomew in Inventing the University, and so he talks about how, and actually I'll just read it because it's that good. So this is 1986, so it's a little while back. Every time students sit down to write for us, they have to invent the university for the occasion. Invent the university, that is, or a branch of it, like history or anthropology or economics or English. They have to learn to speak our language, to speak as we do, to try on the peculiar ways of knowing, selecting, evaluating, reporting, concluding, and arguing that define the discourse of our community. And I remember you talking about with your students how many of them, they have a hard time with this. And I like the idea, too, that Bartholomew brings along here. The idea that for students learning this discourse, they must dare to speak it or to carry off the bluff, since speaking and writing will most certainly be required long before the skill is learned. Okay. Right? And so, you know, you're talking about your students and how doing this writing feels a bit peculiar to them. Yeah. And I think they need to know that's okay. It is going to feel peculiar, right? You are trying on something new. These are new discourses. I use the fancy terms for the languages that we use, right? So they do kind of have to engage in some pretending, some bluffing. Yeah. And that's a huge skill to have, and a huge ability to kind of leap into that role. Take some courage.
What's the difference, I guess, maybe between, and you get this sometimes in people's responses when they are being really sort of candid students about their writing, where they, you know, they say, well, I feel like I'm just faking it.
Yes.
Or, you know, so outside of their usual realm of experience and talking, that writing comes across as something that's quite alien to them, and ways of expressing themselves become stilted or clunky, or the normal ways that they would be able to express themselves in ordinary sort of conversational context breaks down. So the large kind of struggle that they find in adapting themselves to these kind of unfamiliar ways of articulating themselves is something that is sort of like a lifelong journey, and that they really try to wrestle with through the 4 years that they're here.
And I think for me, the hard part for me watching this is that they're so scared about this, right? There isn't this sense of playfulness that goes in this. And if I think about, it's like finding identity, right? Identity, we could be all nervous about it, but I think the better approach to it is to try it on like we try on clothing, right? It's like, well, wear this for a while. Try on that lab coat in biology. Try on, you know, this elements in anthropology. Right. And by trying it on and experimenting with it, and really sort of wholeheartedly entering that role, not holding back, which is what I think some students do, right, because they're scared, but saying, let's really try on this language, try on this approach and this way of thinking about the world, and to encourage students to do that. That I see as a painful piece. Yeah. And for students is, you know, this is a largely undergraduate university, and for students trying to figure out what they're doing, that's hard. Sure. And I think you've mentioned that within new media, right? Yeah,
and just trying to adapt to different kinds of contexts, to learn the protocols and the conventions of these new kind of situations. They don't come to it easily or readily, sometimes not even willingly. Yes. This kind of notion that they have to be flexible and fluid and able to adapt to the requirements of not just kind of specific discursive situations, but different assignment types.
Yes.
As well too, where a common concern or anxiety is like, well, you know, Professor X,
Yes.
doesn't do this, in class Y, and so the big kind of takeaway is the willingness, as you put it, to whether it's kind of carrying off the bluff or achieving that kind of fluidity in different kinds of contexts is kind of the big step one to get in that kind of mindset where you have to be prepared to to put on different hats.
Yes, that degree of flexibility that we're asking from our students is quite high. And I think sometimes for instructors and professors, if they're in a particular discipline, they're sort of thinking within that discipline and sort of ensuring that their assignments speak not only to people within the discipline, right? Because you're going to have students who are, new media majors, but also the ones who are not, who are taking this as their CLR or what have you. It's like, how do you're keeping that audience in mind? How can you ensure that, students are able to approach this from all different angles?
Yeah, so this is another, this kind of adaptability and fluidity piece, ought to be also adopted to some degree to instructors as well too, when they're establishing their assignments, when they're creating their expectations, to know that their particular way of coaxing certain aspects of information or articulating in particular ways is, again, particular to their certain, tradition. And being sort of ensconced within it for a long sort of period of time. Sometimes you can put blinders on in terms of, the larger kind of picture, which is undergraduates being in a particular place for 4 years and having to do all kinds of different sorts of things. So having a little bit maybe a breathing room and to relax a bit, to know that there's, different ways of skinning a cat, and they'll be skinning those cats
lovely metaphor.
Systematically, for the duration that they're here. So, and this is something I struggle with as well too. Is in my own courses where, compared to a lot of colleagues, I teach a lot of non-majors, and I teach a lot of classes that are electives. So I'll have just as many students from outside of my own program as I do from within it. So trying to live up to that necessary versatility that students need to adopt is an ongoing challenge for me as an instructor. I don't know if I always do it well, but I'm trying to remind myself that as I'm kind of grading 100 plus papers in a term is sometimes helpful, I think. So.
Well, and one thing you mentioned before about that I thought was quite nice is that you're not incredibly particular on which style guide people use for citation, right? So citation is something that a lot of students are scared of. So we see a lot of that in the Writing Center, right? Help me check my APA. But for students, usually what I find is that ultimately students usually learn one system really well, right? So they're in one, by they get to their third, fourth year, they've settled on a discipline, and so they get used to one system. But they do have to take GLRs, right? So they do have to take courses from other disciplines and sort of cross. It's liberal education. You're trying to be exposed to various ideas. So, there's the flexibility in the citation styles, I think, is actually kind of useful. There's a friend in political science, and he says, just like you, I don't really care what citation they use as long as they use one. And use it consistently.
Right.
And that to me is then one piece that I see a little bit from students. They come to me and they're like, well, my professor says follow APA, but they want it this way, but that doesn't look like APA to me. And I want to just say, okay, professors, if you really want somebody to follow a citation style, pick one. Right? And actually follow it completely yourself. Don't develop your own idiosyncratic ways of developing this. I mean, that's painful for students. Piece of that, for me at least, that I see is issues of audience. And I know that you've reflected on this, right? So for students, especially if it's their first year, first papers that they're writing, they often kind of retreat to what I see as a very high school level of writing, which is an affirmation about generalized knowledge, right? So it's not really engaging in citation and sort of the academic conversation, right? So instead of taking their sources and saying, okay, this scholar says such and such, and this scholar says such and such, and it's like, oh yeah, let's talk about these ideas and you know, look and then produce their own interpretation. Instead of doing that, they kind of just, maybe they'll pull out quotes or they'll pull out summaries and they'll just kind of lay it down, plop, as fact. Right. And it's like, no, that's not really what's going on here. So students, that lack of familiarity with thinking about what we actually do here at the university, which is really a conversation, right? They miss that. Right. Yeah. I
wonder if part of that is, I mean, just sort of like laying it out there. One of the cardinal sins in being clear or not achieving clarity is this notion of arguing by assertion. Right? Yeah. And that's, you know, recurring sort of comment in the margin is like, arguing by assertion, right? So just kind of plopping something out there, not kind of following through with it, articulating some kind of notion without sort of digging into it, providing sort of context, explanation, evidence, making logical leaps to the next thing. A lot of that for me, I think, comes from an even sort of greater problem, which is wanting to do too many things sometimes at once. So part of the problem of the lack of clarity has to do with a lack of concision and focus to the piece, right? So given that most of my assignments are generally not much longer than, you know, 2,500, 3,000 words, even, you know, even shorter, 1,000, even less, you know, the all caps, bold, underlined instructional text is like one question, one answer, which gives the essay the necessary focus that it does. It allows the students to really accomplish a singular kinds of things. Typically, you get in your essay proposals, which I almost always have them, you know, hand in ahead of time, is, you know, I want to write about the history of, you know, comic books in America from 1947 to 2017. It's like, well, come back to me when your multi-volume encyclopedia is done and I'll write a nice blurb for it. So it's trying to get them to kind of condense and to be, you know, specific.
But I think you've actually named part of the issue there, is that they are used to thinking about good writing as being encyclopedic writing. And encyclopedic writing is useful, right? No doubt. And in many ways, that's kind of a lot of the stuff that's happening in high school. This is affirmed knowledge. This is stuff that we agree upon, right? So we know some of those basics of what happened in, you know, thinking about social studies and World War II and the Cold War stuff. Like this is agreed upon facts. So being able to write it down as agreed upon facts is extremely useful, right? That's good. But now they're moving at a slightly different level where it's like, we're actually interpreting these things now, and they have to do the interpretation.
Yeah, contested knowledge.
That's right. So it's a different style of writing. It's a different form of referencing other sources. It's quite different.
I wonder if this comes out of a recurring sort of anxiety that comes out about, you know, being subjective. Am I being too subjective? Can I write in the first person? You know, the first person question is not just a matter of kind of adhering to necessarily to certain conventions and standards. I think is probably also symptomatic of this kind of greater anxiety about not knowing how to kind of dig into knowledge that is contested and debatable, and wanting to stick to a particular body of agreed upon fact, or to emphasize the facticity of what they're doing. So taking the plunge into a greater pool of confidence, if you will, about knowing where they stand in relation to ideas that are not settled, that are under discussion, that are evolving, even adding their voice to conversations that have been going on sometimes for certain topics for, you know, 1,000 years or more, right? to take on, the confidence of being able to say that I feel this way, or I think this way, or this is how to contend with this particular position.
I often avoid, just as a small thing, I often avoid, especially those two words, I feel, I think. I like to encourage students to do things like I suggest, I observe, I note, right? Because that's different. That's engaging your audience and trying to observe the same things you do. Whereas I feel, feelings are inherently subjective, right? And while we do use that language, especially in our conversation, right? And we know what we mean by that, it's one of those funny words in English that have multiple meanings. So it's just one of those.
Yeah. Do you feel that it can,
exactly
it can lead you, lead you to away from giving things like evidence for your positions, to be more instinctive about a particular idea or topic, rather than cold, detached, objective, whatever that means.
Well, exactly. I think that we're starting to stray into that big philosophical territory, and I think with good reason, right? We do have concerns about objectivity. But I find that for students, particularly when they're entering, the idea that this is a conversation, and that one of the best ways to start the conversation is by helping people perceive things, right? So it's more aspects of perception. So the self doesn't disappear, but it's an area of, it's more an aspect of what we call stance in the discipline. We say, from which position are you observing what goes on? And so by helping other people see things from different positions, and then talking about those things, that I find is a little more profitable than, say, talking about this is inherently subjective, right? Because that becomes this weird binary, objective, subjective. And I don't think that binary exists. So I'd rather say, let's drop some of that language, and instead, let's help people see how we're coming to the knowledge that we're arriving at, right? So, a student is able to talk about, the graphic novel that they've just read, by pulling out evidence from the text, by comparing it to other graphic novels written around the same time, by looking at some of the history of graphic novels, who did that before, and that's evidence. I just got a graphic novel about a First Nations perspective of these two brothers. I wish I could remember the title, but it's also grounded in the person's experience, right? So they're writing it from their own experience. And I wouldn't go so far as to call that a subjective point of view. I would say they're helping us in perception.
Yep. And I think this reminds me of something that we are also talking about in our initial conversations, which is the importance of reading as much as possible in order to improve one's writing. So it's not just a matter of kind of, memorizing some of the conventions of this or that style guide, or kind of brushing up on your grammar, which sometimes helps, couldn't hurt, but also being kind of omnivorous about what you choose to read and read on a regular basis.
Exactly.
So a lot of this kind of comes through osmosis, but also I think maybe kind of picking on what you were just articulating, the ability to shift into thinking about a particular viewpoint from a different kind of stance, or a different kind of tradition, or a different kind of personage. This willingness to expand and to listen to different voices, and to enter into dialogue a little bit more readily by listening to different voices, right? And certainly this speaks to a lot of my own kind of philosophy in assigning readings, from a multiple number of authors, rather than relying on a singular kind of textbook or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's lovely, and I would say that's. If we think, I do teach a little section of grammar when I'm teaching a Writing 1000 course. So in the Writing Center, we do look at grammar, and we'll sort of help people with some sort of main things. It's like, okay, you seem to repeatedly have this issue. This is how you could approach it. But I find interesting, and the studies all affirm this, that we don't learn grammar first, right? It's not like when we're learning to speak, we learn the grammar rules and then we speak. It's, no, the speech comes first. And so when I teach grammar, I always explain to students, you know, that this isn't about following grammatical rules. This is about how grammar is in service of communication. So it comes back to aspects of clarity, right? So you don't aim for good grammar for the sake of good grammar. You aim for good grammar for the sake of communication.
Yeah, otherwise you're Aunt Josephine from, you know, the series of unfortunate events. You know?
Yes. And I think actually, and you mentioned this before, and I think that's a lovely thing to talk about, the elements of style, right? Because I think that's really useful in terms of, and there's other books that are similar to that as well. They're looking at grammar and other aspects for the sake of communication. Yeah. So communication comes first, and yeah. That's huge. And if students can catch that sort of energy and spark, that they want to communicate something, and they want to communicate it to you as the professor, and they want to communicate ideas, then these things, they start to want to do it.
Yeah, and there's simple things that you can do to improve that beyond, you know, again, learning sort of grammatical conventions. I mean, you can do little things like read your sentence out loud after you've written it. And
that is a huge one.
It makes all the difference in the world, you know, because again, if it doesn't make sense coming out of your own mouth, it's probably not going to make sense to
I do that in the Writing Center all the time. I'll be like, okay, here's this paragraph. You just read that one out loud for me. And then they'll read it and like, oh, that doesn't make sense. And they'll correct it themselves, right? They can hear it.
No, I do. I do it myself almost after every sentence, and I've been, you know, writing professionally for years. But this is part of that. It helps with you know, the clarity that we talked about, the focus that's important, and the emphasis on straightforward kind of communication. While you're, again, grammatical knowledge might be perfect, your ability to use it in sometimes in ordinary language can be incredibly helpful in terms of pulling it into what comes out on paper.
Right, yes. And what we do is we have an hour-long appointment one-on-one with people. And you just go to the library website, and on the left-hand side, there's some quick links. You sign in and sign up, pick the time that you want. And I want to give a plug for doing it early, because at the end of the semester, I'm getting, you know, the fall of 2015, I was getting panicked emails from students, please, can you squeeze me in? And it's like, we're all booked. So I find that when I have students that I work with repeatedly, you know, one wonderful student, nervous about writing about philosophy, came in regularly, did a wonderful job, and I could see the improvement over the semester.
Yeah, giving yourself time is huge, and I mean, not just for students, but the more, I think, instructors, whenever possible, allowing students, building a kind of submission process whereby students are planning early, writing things in stages.
Write your proposal.
You know, those kinds of things.
Do something with your sources.
Sometimes, you know, larger classes are harder to manage that than in others, given the constraints of time and the amount of grading that goes into it. But again, the more time, I mean, this just sort of goes without saying. The better your paper is going to be, the longer that you allow it to gestate and to kind of think about it and to consult the Writing Center and come to talk to your instructor, God forbid, about what you're kind of thinking.
Asking for help 2 weeks in advance? Great. Asking for it 2 hours before the thing is due? Not so great.
So that's going to make a huge difference.
So one thing within that then is that aspect of revision. So that's, and that's, you know, instructors can do that, and that trying to structure things, if students follow that process, so that they do start early and then have time for revision. But if students want to improve their writing, like I see that as a major aspect. Write it early, set it aside for a few days, and then come back to it. And you will be amazed at what it's like, that doesn't make any sense, or I left that out or something. So lots of small things that students can do that can easily make a big difference.
Yeah, turn it over to a friend or a peer to have it, you know.
That's right.
Have a go at it.
Yeah, particularly a peer who's like in another discipline, who looks at this and says, I don't understand this at all.
But no, I think these are all good things to be thinking about, both in terms of students, but also I think instructors having a greater degree, I think, of empathy for their undergraduate students, I think maybe is one, closing thing I want to say. And again, it's something I do my best at, not always kind of successfully, but just kind of reimagining myself as an undergraduate with very little experience within this particular role, who may or may not be kind of advancing within this particular discipline, wanting to do, the best I can, but, kind of struggling with some of the complications of what I'm learning, and having the confidence as well to kind of dive into what is a fairly new way for most people of expressing themselves. So to remember that, to have some patience again, I don't always put my money where my mouth is, but I think having a respect for students who are eager to try things out, to carry off the bluff.
Well, I was going to say, it's exactly, it's the flip side of this, right? So if we're asking our students to, try this on, engage in this, see what it's like to be this, we're also asking our professors and instructors to say, think about this, think about what it would be like to be, an undergraduate, never taken a course in this discipline before. Imagine what that's like, and carry off the bluff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Rebekah, for talking about this.
You're welcome. This was very fun.
Absolutely. Cheers. All right.